When France signed the armistice with Germany on June 22, 1940, the world watched as one of Europe's great military powers collapsed in just 6 weeks. The speed of the defeat was shocking, but what happened next to the millions of French soldiers who had been fighting remains one of the war's most complex and lesser-known stories. These men didn't simply vanish. Instead, they found themselves scattered across multiple fates, divided by loyalty, geography, and circumstance into groups that would sometimes even fight each other before the war's end. The scale of France's military disaster was staggering. Between 50 and 90,000 French soldiers were killed during the fighting of May and June 1940. But death in combat was only part of the story. The real question that haunted France for the next 4 years was what happened to those who survived the battle, but lost the war. The largest group of French soldiers met perhaps the harshest fate. During the Battle of France, approximately 1.8 million French soldiers from metropolitan France and across the French Empire were captured and became prisoners of war. This was an unprecedented number, representing a substantial portion of France's adult male population suddenly removed from society. The demographic impact on French towns and villages was immediate and devastating, with entire communities losing most of their young men in a matter of weeks. The Germans moved quickly to transport these prisoners to camps in Germany, though initially many were held in France. After repeated escape attempts, the Germans decided that keeping the prisoners on French soil was too risky, and the vast majority were relocated to camps scattered across Germany and Eastern Europe. The conditions these men faced varied considerably based on geography, time period, and their captors' shifting priorities. The summer of 1940 was particularly brutal for these prisoners. The camp facilities were utterly insufficient to accommodate such enormous numbers of men arriving all at once. Overcrowding was severe, sanitation was primitive, and disease spread rapidly through the camps. The winter of 1940 brought different miseries, with inadequate heating and shelter during what proved to be an exceptionally cold season. Gradually, as some prisoners were repatriated and the camps were reorganized, conditions improved somewhat. However, from 1943 onward, as Germany's war on the Eastern Front turned against them, conditions in the camps deteriorated once again. Food supplies became increasingly precarious, and starvation emerged as a real threat for many prisoners. Once processed and settled into the camp system, French prisoner of wars were put to work. The German war economy desperately needed labor as millions of German men were pulled away to fight, and the French prisoners filled this gap. They worked on farms harvesting crops, in industrial facilities producing war materials, in mines extracting coal and other resources, and on railways maintaining Germany's crucial transportation network. These prisoners lived and worked alongside the German civilian population, leading to a complex mix of relationships. Some Germans treated the French prisoners with hostility, viewing them as enemies. Others developed friendships or at least working relationships based on mutual respect or simple human decency. The fate of these prisoners became a central element of propaganda. For the collaborationist Vichy government, the regime launched numerous programs attempting to encourage young French men and women to volunteer for work in Germany in exchange for the release of a prisoner of war. The idea was that for every 3 French workers who went to Germany, 1 prisoner would be allowed to return home. This program, known as the Relevie, was deeply unpopular and largely unsuccessful in generating sufficient volunteers. Eventually, in 1943, the Vichy government was forced to make such labor mandatory through the Service du Travail Obligatoire, or STO, which required young French men to work in Germany. Throughout the occupation, limited repatriation did occur under certain circumstances. The Germans allowed the return of some French reservists whose specialized civilian occupations were in short supply in Vichy France. Medical workers like doctors and nurses were particularly valued, as were postmen who could maintain communication systems and gendarmes who could maintain order. However, the majority of French prisoners remained in German custody until the very end of the war. According to the terms of the armistice, these men were to remain prisoners until a final peace treaty was negotiated. Since Britain refused to surrender and that peace treaty never came, most prisoners spent nearly 5 years in captivity. Among the 1.8 million French prisoners were approximately 120,000 soldiers from France's colonial empire in North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, the French West Indies, and Indochina. These men faced a dramatically different and often worse experience than their white French counterparts, shaped entirely by Nazi racial ideology and fears. In the summer of 1940, about 40,000 of these colonial prisoners of war were initially sent to camps in Germany. However, Adolf Hitler personally made the decision that non-white prisoners should not be held on German soil, fearing they would somehow contaminate the German population or that their presence would undermine Nazi racial theories. By the end of 1940, virtually all of these colonial prisoners had been moved back to camps in occupied France. They were housed in separate camps from white metropolitan French soldiers, all located on French territory but run by the Germans with French collaboration. One such camp was Frontstalag 230, established in August 1940, which held over 16,000 French colonial troops from Senegal, Gambia, and Mauritania. The Germans regarded these men as submen and treated them accordingly. The conditions in these segregated camps were generally worse than those experienced by white French prisoners. The Germans abandoned most of these colonial soldiers to French administration in 1942, and many remained in these camps until liberation by Allied forces. Their treatment reflected the intersection of colonialism and Nazi racism, leaving these soldiers in a particularly vulnerable position. After some escapes and releases due to disease or political reasons, there were still more than 70,000 colonial prisoners of war in German-occupied France in July 1941. This number declined to about 30,000 by 1944, with roughly 5,000 managing to escape. When Allied forces began liberating France in 1944, they freed at least half of the remaining colonial prisoners, but the Germans transferred between 10 and 15,000 to Germany as they retreated. Not all soldiers who survived the Battle of France ended up in prisoner of war camps. The chaos of defeat created opportunities for many to simply vanish. The early summer of 1940 was marked by a mass exodus of civilians fleeing the advancing German army. At least 6 million French civilians took to the roads, moving south and west to escape what they feared would be brutal German occupation. Their minds were filled with frightening stories from World War I about German atrocities. This enormous movement of people created a unique situation for French soldiers. The crowded roads and overwhelmed railways made it much more difficult for the army to move men and equipment. But for individual soldiers, this chaos offered an opportunity. Ordinary French soldiers who could obtain civilian clothes found it relatively easy to slip away from their disintegrating units and disappear into the crowds of refugees. Many used this opportunity to try to rejoin their families and return to their home communities. The breakdown of military order was so complete in many areas that desertion became not just possible but almost expected. However, this escape route was much more difficult for soldiers from France's colonial empire. These men from Africa, the Caribbean, and Indochina could not easily blend into crowds of French civilians fleeing south and west. Their appearance made them stand out, leaving them far more vulnerable to capture by German forces. Most had little choice but to remain with their units or face capture alone, which often meant ending up in those segregated prisoner of war camps. Under the terms of the armistice signed at Compiègne, Germany allowed the Vichy government to maintain a limited military force. This was called the Armistice Army, and it existed exclusively in the unoccupied southern zone of France and in French colonies that remained loyal to Vichy. The exact authorized strength of this force was carefully specified in the armistice terms: 3,768 officers, 15,072 non-commissioned officers, and 75,360 enlisted men. In addition, the paramilitary gendarmerie was limited to 60,000 men, plus an anti-aircraft force of 10,000. Crucially, all members of the Armistice Army had to be volunteers. This requirement immediately created problems for the Vichy regime. Despite the influx of experienced soldiers returning from the colonial forces, which were also reduced in size under armistice terms, Vichy struggled to find enough volunteers to fill its authorized quota. French men were understandably reluctant to serve in an army that existed at the pleasure of Germany and had no real independence or purpose beyond maintaining internal order. To solve this problem, Vichy initially retained 30,000 conscripts from the class of 1939, keeping them in service until enough volunteers could be found. These conscripts were finally released in early 1942, but even then, Vichy still struggled to maintain sufficient numbers. The regime repeatedly asked the Germans for permission to implement regular conscription, but these requests were always denied. The Armistice Army was deliberately kept weak and obsolete. It was deprived of tanks and other armored vehicles, and desperately short of motorized transport. This was a particular problem for cavalry units, which found themselves relying heavily on horses in an age of mechanized warfare. Surviving Vichy recruiting posters from this period are telling in what they emphasize. Rather than highlighting military power or national defense, they stressed opportunities for athletic activities and horsemanship. This reflected both the Vichy government's ideological emphasis on rural virtues and outdoor activities, and the sad reality that they were recruiting for a small, technologically backward military force that had no real combat purpose. Traditional features of the pre-1940 French army were modified or abandoned. The iconic képi was largely replaced by berets, and the heavy button-back greycoats gave way to simplified uniforms. By early 1942, if you count the colonial forces, the total strength of all Vichy military forces had reached about 550,000 men, including 21,000 officers. However, this army existed in a strange limbo, loyal to a government that was itself subordinate to Germany. The Vichy authorities notably did not use the Armistice Army to fight against resistance groups operating in southern France. That task was instead reserved for other organizations, particularly the Milice, a paramilitary force that became increasingly brutal and notorious as the war continued. The Armistice Army's existence came to an abrupt end in November 1942. Following the Allied invasion of French North Africa in Operation Torch, Germany no longer trusted the Vichy government or its military forces. On November 11, 1942, German forces launched Operation Anton, occupying all of southern France and effectively ending any pretense of French sovereignty in the unoccupied zone. At the same time, Hitler ordered the complete dissolution of the Armistice Army. The Germans made it clear that no French army would be re-established under their control. Soldiers of the Armistice Army faced a choice. They could return to civilian life, join the growing resistance movements, or in some cases collaborate more directly with German forces. While most French soldiers either became prisoners or served the Vichy regime, a small minority made a different choice. They rejected the armistice entirely and continued fighting against Germany. This group would become known as the Free French Forces, led by a relatively junior general named Charles de Gaulle. On June 18, 1940, the day after Marshal Philippe Pétain had called for France to cease fighting, de Gaulle made a radio broadcast from London on the BBC. In this famous appeal of 18th June, he called on French soldiers and civilians to reject the armistice and continue the struggle. De Gaulle's message was stirring and defiant, insisting that the battle for France was not over and that France had not truly lost the war. However, the immediate response was disappointing. By the end of July 1940, only about 7,000 people had volunteered to join de Gaulle in London. Very few of his countrymen initially heard or heeded his call. Several factors explain this poor initial response. First, few French people actually heard the original broadcast. Radio ownership was not universal, and many of those who did listen to the BBC did so secretly. Second, Marshal Pétain was an enormously respected figure in France, the hero of Verdun from World War I. When he told the French people that the war was lost and that they must accept the armistice, most believed him. Third, and perhaps most importantly, few French people in June 1940 believed that Britain could possibly survive alone against Germany. Even within his own government, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced skeptics who thought Britain should negotiate peace. The common view expressed by Pétain himself was that Britain would have its neck wrung like a chicken within 3 weeks. For French soldiers who had been evacuated to Britain during the Dunkirk evacuation and other operations, the situation was even more complicated. Unlike troops trapped in mainland France, these men technically had the opportunity to join de Gaulle. However, they faced enormous pressure not to do so. French authorities made it clear that any soldier who acted independently and joined the Free French would be classified as a deserter. Guards were placed to prevent French soldiers from boarding British ships to join de Gaulle. The British themselves created obstacles, as they were keen to recruit these experienced French soldiers into their own forces, rather than turning them over to de Gaulle's movement. The Royal Navy's attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Khaber in Algeria on July 3, 1940, further poisoned the atmosphere. Churchill had ordered this attack to prevent French warships from potentially falling into German hands, but the operation resulted in the deaths of over 300 French sailors. This tragedy created enormous bitterness in France toward Britain, and by extension, toward anyone like de Gaulle who was associated with the British. It certainly did not encourage French soldiers to escape to Britain and join the Free French. Despite these obstacles, the Free French movement slowly grew. French colonial territories began declaring for de Gaulle rather than Vichy. Chad, French Equatorial Africa, French Indochina, and French territories in India, New Caledonia, and the New Hebrides all joined the Free French cause. This gave de Gaulle something crucial: a territorial base and a source of fighting men beyond the handful of volunteers in London. Free French forces began to participate in combat operations, fighting in Egypt, Syria, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. They served with distinction, and gradually their reputation grew. The real transformation came in late 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. The colonial French forces stationed there, the Army of Africa, had remained loyal to Vichy throughout the occupation. When American forces landed in November 1942, these Vichy forces initially resisted but quickly surrendered and switched sides. This defection brought a substantial, well-equipped army over to the Allied side. However, it also created a political crisis. These forces were commanded by General Henry Giraud, not de Gaulle, and the Americans strongly preferred Giraud as the leader of French forces. President Franklin Roosevelt deeply distrusted de Gaulle, viewing him as a potential dictator and questioning his legitimacy since he had never been elected to any position. There followed a complicated struggle for control of the French war effort. De Gaulle and Giraud initially shared power in the French Committee of National Liberation, established in Algiers in June 1943. However, de Gaulle was a far more skilled political operator, and he gradually outmaneuvered Giraud. By the spring of 1944, Giraud had resigned, leaving de Gaulle in supreme control of all French forces fighting outside of occupied France. On August 1, 1943, the Free French forces officially ceased to exist as a separate entity, merging with Giraud's forces to form what became known as the French Liberation Army. Meanwhile, within France itself, resistance movements had been growing since 1940. These groups operated independently at first, divided by geography, politics, and ideology. They ranged from communist organizations like the Francs, Terrazet partisans to more conservative groups, and from urban networks gathering intelligence to rural Maquis bands conducting sabotage. De Gaulle was determined to bring these diverse groups under his leadership. He sent Jean Moulin back to France with the enormously difficult task of uniting the major resistance groups. After extensive negotiations, Moulin succeeded in May 1943 in establishing the Conseil National de la Résistance, the National Council of the Resistance, which brought 8 major resistance groups together under de Gaulle's authority. These internal resistance forces were formalized as the French Forces of the Interior. By the time of the D-Day landings in Normandy in June 1944, the Free French forces and their associated resistance movements numbered over 400,000 men and women. When Allied forces landed in Provence in southern France in August 1944, French forces participated in the liberation of their own country. French units were the first to enter Paris on August 24, 1944, fulfilling de Gaulle's promise that the French capital would be liberated by French soldiers. By the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, France had 25 million troops under arms, with 10 divisions fighting in Germany alongside American, British, and other Allied forces. The human cost of France's military involvement in World War II was substantial and complex. During the war, French military losses totaled about 212,000 dead. Of these, approximately 92,000 were killed during the brief campaign of 1940. Another 58,000 died between 1940 and 1945 in other campaigns fighting with either the Free French or after 1942 with the forces that had switched from Vichy to the Allied side. About 24,000 were lost while serving with the French resistance inside occupied France. Perhaps most controversially, another 38,000 Frenchmen died while serving in the German army, including 32,000 who were forced conscripts from Alsace-Lorraine, a region that Germany had annexed. More than 200 French prisoners of war died in the camps where they were held. The exact death toll among colonial prisoners is harder to determine, but conditions in their segregated camps and the discrimination they faced certainly led to higher mortality rates. As the war turned against Germany in 1944 and 1945, conditions for all prisoners of war deteriorated sharply. Food supplies became erratic and starvation emerged as a real threat. As Soviet forces advanced from the east, many camps were evacuated and prisoners were forced on brutal death marches westward in terrible conditions. After the war ended, the experience of French soldiers who had lived through the defeat and occupation became a deeply sensitive topic in French society. The swift German victory and humiliating armistice were painful memories that many French people preferred to forget. Post-war France focused instead on more glorious narratives: the heroism of the resistance, the achievements of the Free French forces, and the liberation of France. The soldiers who had fought and lost in 1940, and especially those who had spent years as prisoners in Germany, were largely ignored in official commemorations and public memory. There was an unsuccessful campaign in the French press in 2015 to establish a state commemorative event and memorial honoring the war dead from France and its empire who fell in 1940, with campaigners calling them the first resistance fighters. Former President François Hollande expanded the number of state commemorative events for key moments in France's 20th century history, but even he avoided the events of 1940. The defeat remained, and to some extent still remains, a topic many French people would rather not discuss in detail. The prisoners of war faced particular difficulties in post-war France. A national organization of former prisoners was established, the Fédération Nationale des Combattants Prisonniers de Guerre, which campaigned for the rights of former prisoners of war. However, these men were explicitly banned by a court from referring to themselves as deportees, a term that had been exclusively applied to political prisoners and Holocaust victims. No special medal was ever created for prisoners of war, though nearly 30,000 prisoners who had managed to escape from German camps were awarded the Médaille des Évadés, the Escapees Medal. The topic of French prisoners of war remained relatively under-researched in French historical scholarship for many years. The first major academic study dedicated specifically to this subject was Yves Durand's book La Captivité, published in 1980, 40 years after the defeat. In popular culture, the subject appeared earlier, with the comedic film La Vache et le Prisonnier released in 1959, directed by Henry Verneuil. Robert Merle's 1949 novel Weekend at Dunkirk, which dealt with the experience of French soldiers during the evacuation, was adapted into a successful film in 1964 that drew 3 million viewers. The fate of French soldiers after the fall of France in 1940 reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of France's experience in World War II. These men did not disappear. Instead, they were scattered across multiple paths that sometimes diverged sharply and sometimes crossed back over each other. Some spent years in German prisoner-of-war camps, their labor exploited for the Nazi war machine while their absence devastated French communities. Others served in the limited and constrained Armistice Army of Vichy, caught between loyalty to France and collaboration with Germany. Still others disappeared into civilian life, using the chaos of defeat to escape military service entirely. A small but significant number rejected defeat entirely and joined de Gaulle's Free French, eventually growing into a force of hundreds of thousands that helped liberate their own country. The colonial soldiers who fought for France faced additional burdens of racism and segregation, even from their supposed allies. Many returned to their home countries after the war, having fought for the freedom of France, while their own peoples remained under colonial rule. The irony was not lost on them, and their wartime service would contribute to growing independence movements across the French Empire in the post-war years. What makes this story particularly poignant is how quickly it was buried in French national memory. The very swift German victory and the humiliating armistice that followed meant that post-war French society sought to minimize and forget the defeat, preferring to concentrate on more glorious narratives of the resistance and the Free French. The soldiers who fought in 1940 and the nearly 2 million who became prisoners were largely written out of the national story, their sacrifices and suffering deemed too painful or too embarrassing to commemorate publicly. Yet their story is essential to understanding World War II. It reminds us that military defeat is not just about statistics and battle maps, but about millions of individual human beings whose lives are torn apart and reconfigured by forces beyond their control. It shows us that even in defeat, people make choices, sometimes brave ones, sometimes pragmatic ones, and sometimes simply trying to survive as best they can. The French soldiers of 1940 faced an impossible situation, and their varied responses to that situation reveal much about the complexity of human nature under extreme pressure. The question of what happened to French soldiers after France fell in 1940 does not have a single answer. It has nearly 2 million answers, each one a human story of survival, compromise, resistance, or collaboration. Some of those stories are heroic, some are tragic, and some are deeply uncomfortable. But all of them deserve to be remembered and understood as part of the larger history of World War II and the world it created.